So then why get into this race so late? What was it about the other 45 people on the ballot that made you say they're not good enough?
Well, that wasn't why I got into the race. Arnold Schwarzenegger, by the way, got into the race late. I was trying to decide whether or not I wanted to do it. You know, Morgan, I have a good life. No one's picking over my private life, at least not the way they've done since I've gotten into this race. I was making a good living. This is threatening all of that. Um, so I really wasn't sure I wanted to do it, but so many people I respect approached me, including Dennis Prager, without whom I wouldn't be on the air, Pastor Jack Hibbs, a woman named Jenny Sand, and a longtime friend of mine who is now my campaign manager, Lionel Chetwin, a longtime filmmaker who has done the film Hanoi Hilton. And he also approached me and asked me to run. But I still didn't want to do it, Morgan. And so I began talking to normal people, like my barber, like the guy who owns a company who drives me. Every now and then he drives me himself. And I asked normal people what they thought I should do. And I was surprised how many people thought I could contribute. You know, I've been writing about things like the rising cost of living here in California, that for the very first time, people are now leaving the state. And it's not just millionaires and billionaires, although they are. The exodus of companies leaving California for the first 6 months has exceeded the exodus at this time last year. Middle class people are leaving. I've been writing about that. I've been writing about my position of choice in public education. I'm a product of public education. And my school was certainly inferior compared to some of the better schools in the area at the time. But the school that I went to, Crenshaw High School, recently, Morgan, I just checked, only 2% of kids can do math at state levels of proficiency. I've been an advocate for school choice. And I've been talking about the way this man has shut down the state, in my opinion, against science, while arrogantly flouting the very rules he's been putting down the throats of everybody else. So the more I thought about it, the more I thought I had been talking about these issues for a very long period of time.
You mentioned Governor Gavin Newsom shutting down the state against science, like you said. So I'm going to ask you a few natural follow-up questions, questions that have been asked in the debate. You know, what would you do to protect, for example, school children?
Well, I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I've been vaccinated because of my age category. I'm in a higher risk. Also, I've got a rare blood condition, and my doctor strongly advised me to be vaccinated. And I think people who are in high-risk categories, given their age, ought to be vaccinated. But I also think that there's freedom of choice in America. And a lot of people feel very differently about the vaccine. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris both said if Donald Trump told them to take the vaccine, they wouldn't do it. A lot of people feel they've already contracted the coronavirus and have natural immunities to it. And I was in Palm Desert not long ago on a campaign swing, and I went to a coffee shop and I noticed that half the wait staff was wearing masks and half the wait staff was not. The young lady who waited on me, later on she told me she was a senior in college, was not wearing a mask. And I asked her whether there was a policy in the shop, and she said no. Our boss allows us to wear a mask if we feel we want to or need to. And allows us not to wear one if we don't want to and don't feel that we need to. And I asked her whether she'd been vaccinated. She said she hadn't. And I said, may I ask you why? She said, you can ask, but smiled and said, but I don't have to tell you why. I think this is America. And I think parents should make the decision on whether or not they want their children to wear a mask and going to school, whether or not they want their children to be vaccinated. And I think private businesses should also make that decision. But as governor, if there are state mandated masks and state mandated vaccinations or tests for people who have not been vaccinated and their state workers, I'm going to repeal those.
So yeah, I know I've seen your social media post where you said that you would repeal it on day one. So I guess the next question is, would you get in the way of local mandates if a local school district wanted to impose a mask mandate?
No, I would not. I would recommend against it. I think local municipalities have a right to be foolish. You know, I don't believe in rent control, for example, but I think that if a local municipality wants to impose rent control, they should have that right to do it. Private schools have made different decisions, and I would imagine local districts are going to make different decisions. But parents are also going to make their own decisions. And I think one of the reasons that we're having a greater push for choice in education, which I'm a proponent of, is because a lot of parents don't feel that their kids should be mandated to wear masks, don't feel that their teachers should be mandated to be vaccinated. And I think a lot of parents are going to be making decisions that are going to be very inconsistent with what school boards want. And I think it's going to cause more and more parents to push for choice in education. So there are consequences besides pushing kids around and pushing parents around. They're going to fight back.
Do you believe one of the other big topics right now is obviously the forest fires happening in Northern California, where I am? Do you believe in climate change, and what has Gavin Newsom done to protect people against fires, and what would you do differently?
I'm not a climate change denier. I've never been a climate change denier. I believe that climate change is real, and I do believe that man has a role in it. But I believe that Gavin Newsom has mismanaged the forest. He has misled Californians by a factor of 7 as to how many fallen trees he's cleared. He claimed he cleared 90,000 acres, which frankly is a drop in the bucket. He cleared only 13% of that. Outgoing Governor Jerry Brown had a plan to clear 500,000 acres of fallen trees. It hasn't been pursued. And also, I just recently saw an interview on Spectrum One where they interviewed a woman who just done a documentary on the fires. And she admitted that she thought that when she started the documentary, that the larger reason, or the biggest reason for the fires was climate change. And she realized the biggest reason was mismanagement of the forest, that the trees have grown too thick. We've had she didn't make this argument, but we've had an anti-logging narrative in California, so that the logging industry is only a shell of what it used to be. The trees have grown way too thick, and we're spending insufficient money and insufficient manpower clearing them. And she conceded that she was wrong about her assertion that climate change was the primary factor. And I don't believe she was a conservative, just up in Kern County. And farmers are hopping mad over the fact that we have not added appreciably to our water infrastructure in almost 40 years, when the state was half the size it is. We're not spending enough on underground storage, on reservoirs, on dams, on canals, and much of the water is draining right into the Pacific Ocean. To make a very complicated problem simple, it's this: we're not storing enough water in wet years so that we're preparing for dry years. Droughts are God-made, but shortages are man-made. There's something we can do about that. One of the reasons we're having rolling brownouts is because of these increasing mandates on our utility companies to get a lot of the power from wind and solar. Wind and solar are unreliable, and the more money you're taking away for wind and solar, the less money you're putting in for fire prevention. And so a lot of these down power lines would have been avoided had the utilities had more money to deal with this. And many of the power lines should be buried underground, which is very expensive. And the more money you're taking away from the power companies and putting them into wind and solar, which, as I said earlier, are unreliable, the less money we have for fire safety and fire prevention. I make one more thing. I also think that we ought to take another look at nuclear. We only have one nuclear power plant left, and that's Diablo, and that's going to be decommissioned in a few years. San Onofre was just decommissioned. That's one of the reasons we had a rolling brownouts. We got about 8 to 10% or so of our power from nuclear, and we're getting an increasingly small percentage of our power from nuclear. France and Japan, both countries we have positive views on, get the majority of their power from nuclear, and I think we ought to take another look at that. When I say that, people conjure up images about 3 Mile Island. Well, nobody died at 3 Mile Island. A, and B, the technology is so much better than it was then. Nuclear is CO2 free, it's emissions free, it's clean. And so I think we ought to take a look at that. And I think the way that nuclear has been badmouthed has contributed to the rolling brownouts.
Speaking about being clean, what do you think about Gavin Newsom's order to make all cars clean or energy efficient by 2035? They all have to be.
I don't think much of it at all. I think that even if you were to make California carbon neutral by whatever year he says, it will have virtually zero effect on the climate when you have countries like India and China spewing out CO2 left and right. So I don't think it'll have any effect whatsoever, except cause another greater loss of middle-class jobs and working-class jobs. There has been a war on the middle class, a war on the working class by the politicians in Sacramento and by Gavin Newsom.
What do you think about Caitlyn Jenner and Kevin Faulconer calling for you to drop out of this race?
I don't think much of it one way or the other. I've not made any negative comment about my Republican rivals. The real target is Gavin Newsom. 51% plus one must vote to remove Gavin Newsom. And voters need to be reminded of the arrogant way this man shut down the state. He also mandated mask outdoors while his own 2 kids were at a summer camp not wearing masks. He exempted his own winery from the very mandates that he foisted down the throats of the Californian people. And nearly 1/3 of all small businesses are now gone. Unlike a lot of politicians, I have run a business. I ran a small business. It was a tiny business. I only had about a dozen employees at my peak, but it didn't go bankrupt. I didn't liquidate it. I sold it, and it kept going on for years and years. I think one of the problems we have in this state is a whole bunch of people in Sacramento have never run a lemonade stand, and they're telling people who run businesses what to do.
How do you get Democrats and independents to vote for you? Or are you kind of hoping that they sit this one out and don't vote so that you can win?
No, I want Democrats and independents to vote for me because I'm common sense. I think the number one issue for a lot of people living in the inner city, as I said, is education. And the public education that many kids in urban settings getting is absolutely lousy. Again, we're at the bottom of near the bottom of the other 49 states. 75% of Black boys cannot read at state levels of proficiency pre-pandemic. Half of third graders cannot read at state levels of proficiency pre-pandemic. The number one impediment to choice is the teachers union. They're the largest funder of my competitor. And by the way, my competitor has been able to raise, I think, around $50 million from the teachers union, from the public sector unions, from big tech, and from Hollywood. I'm a little old guy trying to raise a little bit of money, and I'm urging people to go to electelder.com and throw a little something in the tip jar so we can make this a fair fight.
Is there a state, if you had to pick one, that you think handled the pandemic as well as it could have been handled?
I really haven't thought about that. I just want to make sure that I handle it consistent with science and consistent with the freedoms that Americans have always had. Thomas Jefferson warned us against trading freedom for public safety, and I think he was right. I'm going to rely on the common sense and the intelligence of the American people, and for people to consult with their own doctors to make decisions, as I did. Again, I've been vaccinated. I'm not anti-vaccine. I believe that people in high-risk categories should get vaccinated, but there are people that feel differently.
Do you think that there should be someone in the middle of Newsom and DeSantis, or would you say DeSantis did it perfectly?
I know what you're trying to do, and it's not going to work. I've already given you my answer. I'm going to rely on the common sense of Californians, on their good judgment, and allow them to consult with their own doctors and make their decisions that they believe are fit for them and for their families.
What is something that you want voters to know about you?
Well, I find it interesting that we're having conversations about anything other than what I think people are upset about. People are hurting in California. The average price of a home in California costs $800,000. That's outrageous. The average price of a home in America is 150%. It's 150% more than the average.
How do you solve it?
By unleashing the private sector, by allowing developers to actually build, by loosening the stranglehold that environmental extremists have on Sacramento. We have probably a shortage of 1 million units here in California. There are hundreds of thousands of units all ready to go. They're being held up for fear of lawsuits. And Lord knows how many developers aren't even trying to develop for fear that there's too many taxes and regulations that cause the price of a house to be much higher than it otherwise would be. One of the people I've often had on my radio show is a brilliant economist named Leo Hanian. He is with UCLA. And he says the average price of a home mortgage in California is 50% more than it would be, but for the extremist environmental rules and regulations that jack up the price of a home.
Homeless people are everywhere. How do you solve it?
Sounds like you're going to vote for me. Well, one thing I won't do is to have a housing first policy, which is what Gavin Newsom and his cohorts in Sacramento have done. That is to say, to build homes far more expensively, by the way, than would be the case if the private sector built them, without dealing with the underlying problem of why people are on the streets in the first place. Some percentage of them are schizophrenic. By that I mean of danger to themselves or to others. Not long ago, Gavin Newsom was attacked by a mentally ill homeless person, but for his security detail, who knows how he would have been hurt. But the bulk of them are people who have mental illness or who are addicted to some sort of substance. I believe churches should get involved. I don't think government can do this, but I think churches can, synagogues can, mosques can. Allow them to adopt a street, adopt a neighborhood, adopt a block, and then make sure that we unleash the power of the private developers so we can build low-cost housing to put them somewhere. I spoke with Dr. Ben Carson, the former head of HUD, and he told me that near the end of the administration, they had a plan that even the LA mayor, Eric Garcetti, agreed to. They had large swaths of federal land that were not going to be burdened by the rules and regulations that caused the price of a house to be so much higher. They had plenty of money for treatment, and people would then be moved there. That's a plan that he thought was workable, thought it was viable. He sent it to me, and I think it makes a lot of sense. But the way that the Newsom is going about it, which is just to build housing without dealing with the underlying reason why people are there, is only going to exacerbate the problem. You can't make them go, you can't make them stay. And furthermore, you're sending a welcome mat to other states in cold weather climates saying, well, I'm going to come to California and be treated with care and compassion, which everybody deserves. I can get free needles, I can get free food and get a free house. So a lot of cops tell me a lot of people on Skid Row and people who are pitching tents aren't even from California.
About your ex-fiance's comments about you brandishing a gun, did that in fact happen?
No, it didn't. Beyond that, I'm not going to respond to any of the other silly accusations. My defense is my record. My defense is my character. I'm almost 70 years old. I've been single for all but 2 years of my life. That's the only time anybody ever made such an accusation. So I'm standing on my record, and I'm going back to the issues that really matter. And those issues are crime, the rising cost of living, homelessness that we just now talked about, the way this man shut down the state, ignoring science, the fact that we have rolling brownouts, and the fact that we have a water shortage in the state that's got everything going for it. We ought not be having these kinds of things. This is all about bad leadership in the governor's state house, and bad leadership in the legislative area, where we have 2/3 of Democrats that seem to believe that you can just tax, spend, and regulate people, and it won't have any effect. I mentioned to you that businesses were leaving. The narrative used to be, well, high-tech businesses are never going to leave because we want them to stay here. They're clean burning. They don't emit a lot of CO2. Well, high-tech businesses are also leaving. So for all those reasons, 1.7 million people signed a petition to have this man removed, and a good 1/3 of them were the Democrats and independents who voted for him just 2 years earlier.
And there is one follow-up question though. Why take the time to say that about you? It's not like she doesn't want the recall to happen. She endorsed Faulkner.
I've given you my answer.
Is this all so stressful for you? Is it worth it?
I feel I have something to contribute. The reason I'm doing this is because I feel I have a moral, a spiritual. I'm a man of faith. I am pro-life. I feel I have a moral, a spiritual, and patriotic duty to do this. I would not be happy with Larry Elder if I avoided the responsibility just because people are going to ask a few questions that I find unpleasant. So no, I don't regret this at all. I think I'm going to be able to be a very good governor and a very effective governor for California, and I think I'm going to be able to make people's lives better. So I'm happy that I'm doing this, and I'm proud of myself for doing it.